You've structured a number of your plays, Arcadia, The Invention of Love, and Indian in two separate time periods. What is it about that approach that appeals to you as a playwright?
Well, I'll just put a paragraph in front of the answer. It's very nice to be here. Thank you very much.
I should have said something like that, but they know me already.
He's here all the time, so it's no big deal for him.
Actually, I have my best and my worst.
It's a beautiful place. Well, thanks for coming. I'm really to entertain you much more than we intend to instruct you. Is that right?
Well, I hope so.
So it was about...
I was asking about the two time periods and why that appeals to you.
Well, I guess I really should stop doing that because it appeals to me a lot, and I may have actually used it up by now. As a matter of fact, Indian ink is another of those. You mentioned Arcadia, didn't you?
Mm-hmm.
And Indian ink.
The Invention.
And the Invention of Love, that's right. Any more?
Well, those are the three that I remember. There may be others, but I don't think so, although...
Well, so what this is about is plays which take place in two periods, sometimes widely separated. I can think of one play where they're separated by the best part of a couple of hundred years. In the play which, funny enough, is opening tonight. Why? Are you wondering why I'm here?
Yes. You've seen the play before?
But that wouldn't get me off that hook, no. What happened was, maybe it's because we're existing in two time periods, 48 hours apart. My play, the opening night of my play, was postponed for 2 days by the Roundabout Theatre about, I don't know, a few weeks ago. And I said, that's fine, but I'm not going to be there because I'm at Queen's, and I'm not going to turn around and say I can't do it now because I've got an opening night. So, to my well, to my disappointment, they didn't mind at all. They had absolutely no objection to my coming to Queen's.
But you'll be there.
They actually, they were fine about, really what they were thinking is, it's fine as long as I'm there at the end for the photograph. So I will be there at the end and I'll be photographed. This is nothing to do with your question, but theatre isn't going that way, I'm afraid. This is no disrespect to any theatre's presence or absence. It's just a fact of life nowadays. But the work of art is becoming a kind of occasion for the existence of a vast marketing organization. And it's very much to do with kind of public awareness of theatre. People, it's interesting that this is a subscription theatre, and I've never really entirely understood what that meant. But in the case of this theatre, it means that people, they don't subscribe to the play or the plays separately or collectively, they subscribe to the season. So that's what they're actually committing to. They're committing to going to live theatre. They're not committing to going to Indian Ink by Tom Stoppard, which they probably didn't even know was in the season. So you understand what I'm saying? There's something about live theatre which won't die. Now,
but wait a minute, there are the subscribers who do it year after year after year, and then there are the subscribers who saw that two of your plays were being presented at the Roundabout, and they subscribed to this year.
New subscribers, is it?
Sure. There are always empty spaces, in fact, probably quite, and there are people who definitely would want to have seen these two plays. Especially since in the case of Indian Ink, it's only rarely been shown in the United States. And, has it ever been shown in New York? Has it ever been played here? Or?
In New York?
Yeah.
No.
So it was Washington and somewhere else?
Well, San Francisco. Indian Ink was done first in San Francisco by the same director who's now doing it at the Roundabout Theatre. Her name is Carrie Perloff. She's run ACT in San Francisco, that's American Conservatory Theatre, for 20 years. And she's a devotee of the play. And it's taken her at least 10 years to persuade a theatre in New York to take it on, because it's got quite a large cast by the standards of modern theatre economics. And also I have to say that 10 years ago there weren't that many Indian actors around, and half the cast is Indian, and they're important roles, very important. So the times have come to meet us, and now we're here, which is nice. Now, about double, are you still interested?
Well, this is the sort of thing they do in films, but rarely in theater because it's just so hard to pull off. I was thinking about the fact that this actually began as a radio play called In the Native State, and I would think that setting a radio play 50 years apart back and forth would have even been more difficult to pull off.
The BBC radio drama people have known in succeeding generations since I first started writing. And I was in the situation of, say, promising them a play. Yes, I will definitely do a play this year, etc., etc. I had no thought of what the play might be about. And I really wrote it for Felicity Kendall, who grew up in India, to whom I have great love and admiration. So I thought, okay, I'll write a play for her, and that's what I did. I didn't know, of course, that I was also writing the last role that Peggy Ashcroft would ever play in any medium. And she played the role, of course, which in New York is being played by Rosemary Harris. And subsequently, the play worked pretty well on the radio, and I thought there must be a way of adapting it to the stage. And it's different in many respects. It's the same spirit and much the same story, which is more important, because I think theatre is a storytelling art form above all.
Well, it still must have been easier to understand than another BBC radio play you did, Artist Descending a Staircase, which had multiple levels of flashback. You were making it difficult for those BBC listeners, weren't you?
Well, first of all, it was adapted for the stage. I don't really understand how, because it was written for radio to the degree that sound effects were a large part of the plot, the mystery sound effect. But that play had I think the word might be palindromic. What it was the first scene and the last scene took place in they were the same, as it were, long moment. And the second scene and the second last scene were earlier and in the same moment, and so on. So it was kind of this inverted pyramid. And they got to the kind of point of the pyramid and then went back outwards again. Whether the listeners were aware of this beautiful refinement, I'm not sure. Anyway, so that's right, that was difficult.
Well, as Joe mentioned, you said you tend to avoid drawing upon your own life when you write a play, and that Indian Ink is an exception. But why have you avoided using things from your own life in your other plays? Or have you, just in ways that haven't been apparent because they're not really autobiographical?
I'm not a biographical writer. Indian Ink is set in India in 1930.
Before you were born.
Before I was born. I was in India for 4 years, between the ages of 4 and 8. So clearly, I wasn't writing about my own memories. Though in a certain sense, I was writing about feelings I had about India, and also the memory of smells and tastes, which wouldn't have changed anyway. So it was an India that I felt at home in. And you know, I got to England when I was 8 years old, and I had a huge nostalgia for India. I think Joe mentioned I used to dream about India. I did. I used to dream about India a lot.
Is India where you became British to some degree?
Yeah,
Because you had a British education, your mother married.
I was educated in English, mostly at an American school, but yeah, it became my first language. But we were not, as was mentioned, we were Czech refugees, a group of us, barter people, that's the shoe company. And we belonged to them, and we were not members of the Raj, but we were European, and towards the end of the war, and at the end of the war, my father having been killed, we did actually marry into the Raj, if you like, because my mother married a British Army officer, whose name I now have. It was quite a dramatic childhood, I suppose, but I wasn't really aware of it very often as being a particularly interesting childhood.
How aware were you of the fact that India was nearing its end as a British colony? Was that something that a child would have even have noticed?
No,
Were people talking about it?
I certainly hadn't. It wasn't until years later that I began to understand that the independence movement on the subcontinent was actually interrupted by the Second World War. It wasn't something which simply happened after World War II. Well, there's an elderly lady in my play who went to India when she was 20 or something. And she has an argument with a young Indian artist when she's at home. And the artist points out to her that imperial history is very much a subjective idea, and he points out to her that when the Europeans arrived in the age of Shakespeare, he says, we had our own Shakespeare. In fact, we had our literature and culture which went back earlier than Chaucer. And he furthermore points out, we were rich, that's why you came. And she just loses her temper with him. She's got the absolute, she has that Anglo-Indian view of things, which I remember as being my own, and it was just the water that the goldfish was in, and it consisted of a response which roughly goes, no, we made you a proper country, and when we left, you fell to pieces. You should be ashamed.
On the other hand, the artist has memorized the London subway map, and he knows where all of the blue plaques are throughout London, the plaques that tell you that so-and-so lived here once. And she gets frustrated with him for that because she wants him to be more Indian.
Yeah, we relied it into more than one character in the play.
Oh, yes.
I know what you're saying.
Yeah. This is, I'm talking now about the Flora Crew,
Yes.
the center of the British poet.
She would have the view in 1950, which many people in this audience would have now, including many young women in our own time. And the view was a kind of anger against those educated Indians who were still enthralled by Englishness and Britishness.
Had tea regularly. I mean, had British-style tea, not in the afternoon. They had gentlemen's clubs and the kind of private schools that the British created. A lot of Indian life at that level is modelled on the British experience, the British values. I went back to Darjeeling 40 years after I left, and I was there a while, and the older people I met, the elderly people I met, they had a kind of, not a nostalgia, but they felt that whatever else you could say about it, when the British were running Darjeeling, you didn't have to bribe the magistrates, because there's a huge amount of corruption which you have to deal with in normal life. And you could say the same. This is not a statement about India. A lot of corruption in Czechoslovakia, which is where I was born. There's corruption in modern life. Did you speak any Czech or any Chinese when you were living in Shanghai?
No, that's not me.
Oh no, well, you lived in where? Where did you go in China?
Darjeeling was in northern India.
No, I know, but there was a stopover before then. You had to leave with the Japanese.
This is so interesting. What you're remembering is a book and a film called Empire of the Sun.
Oh.
And all those things happened.
So you went right from Czechoslovakia to India?
He's going to interview me on the radio tomorrow, and I'm very thinking, thank God I got that out of the way. I was sort of, I understand that because the confusion, because they're remarkably similar stories.
I have to tell you, it's Wikipedia, and I can't trust it. Yes, I hate Wikipedia, but okay. They conflated that with your life, and I went right along with it because,
Is that a joke, or did they
look on your Wikipedia entry. You had to leave because the Japanese invaded modern India.
The older I get, the gladder I get that I don't have a computer.
You don't even transcribe what you've written onto the computer?
No, I write in pen and ink. And when I need to look something up, my wife Sabrina looks it up for me. She has I don't know how to word it.
Don't trust what she finds in Wikipedia. But so English really is your first language. The reason
I think it is.
The reason I ask is someone suggested that writers who come to English as a second language, like Conrad, Nabokov, Sebald, Peckham Seth, actually care for English more than the English do. And since so much of your work, especially the early plays like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead, and the Real Inspector Hound were full of witty dialogue and puns and word jokes, I was wondering whether that was because you fell in love with the language in a way that somebody who just grew up in it might not have.
Well, I don't really psychologize myself, but I think that there is some truth in that. I think that I started using English as though I'd simply, as it were, waded into a paddling pool, whereas if you're born English, you just get wet as you grow up. I don't really know how that affects your regard for the language. I wouldn't push these probabilities abilities too far. I've got a brother who is 2 years older than I am. We went everywhere together. We had the same education, and so on. But he wouldn't conform very closely to your sense of how I use the English language.
Well, maybe he's
a retired accountant.
Maybe he was in Shanghai.
That's where he went.
Kenneth Tynan once said, "You must never forget that Stoppard is an emigre." Do you object to that?
No. But it has no conscious reality for me. I mean, I don't, as it were, factor it in on a conscious level. It's a fact about me, perhaps.
Does Flora, as the lost beloved in Indian Ink, correspond to Thomasina in Arcadia and Moses in the Adventure of Love? Plays that also cut back and forth between characters in two time periods.
Sorry, these are stories which I have to invent. I don't think of them as it were, combining in some way to promulgate an idea about time or travel. I didn't really understand the question.
Well, you said that your characters' conversations amount to a dialectic with yourself, and that writing dialogue is the only respectable way of contradicting oneself. And I was thinking, do the plays also, are they also engaged in some kind of a dialogue? So there's certain ideas that are in one then get dealt with differently in another. For example, Indian Ink includes a discussion of A. Houseman, and of course that foreshadows the invention of love.
I think you're absolutely right, but it happens backwards.
Thank God you understood the question.
Of course, but it happens backwards. It's when you look back, you can see these things, and it's all true. But they don't, as it were, they're not the consequence of some kind of program I have in mind as I push these plays forward.
I wasn't suggesting.
I know that, but what I'm trying to say is that maybe a college is not the most sympathetic place to try to make this point, but nevertheless, I'm bound to say that the things which might be said about my plays, collectively or severally, for all that they could very well be true, are not actually that interesting because, well, not to me, because they don't come from a set of principles. You sit down each time. I didn't mention that I think theatre is a storytelling art form. More and more, I think the less you know about the story while you're trying to imagine it, the better. So you're just trying to push forward a narrative in ways that are not too predictable, and with any luck actually are unpredictable. Because when something unpredictable happens, you suddenly go, oh, instead of...
So like many novelists will tell you that they had no idea where the book was going to go. They started and then the characters took over. You would say the same sort of thing happens with this? The characters take on a life of their own and then you follow them to some degree?
Yes, actually, I know how that sounds to most people. It sounds vaguely pretentious. It just happens to be a spooky fact about art, I think, not just about writing plays.
So you don't know how it's going to end when you start?
That's not necessarily true. You might know about certain things which are in the future of the work. But they may not happen at the time when you thought they would happen. And very often, I guess, you kind of know what the destination is, but you might be wrong about that as well. It's hard to describe, but you can see, I'm sure you can understand, that a story has to have a kind of psychological integrity. And if you get the feeling as you're reading or watching a play that the story, the characters, the plot are being kind of wrenched a bit to conform to some scheme, you begin to lose, you may not even express the thought even to yourself, but what's happening is you're losing faith in truthfulness of what's going on up there. So what you have to try to do as the artist in this transaction, you have to stop thinking, I must at all accounts have the body fall out of the closet at the end of the third scene. That kind of thinking. It's probably fine for farces where there's a kind of mechanistic substructure to a play. But normally, when you're writing about people in their lives, interacting with each other, you're writing about people who are being defined as every page gets written. They're being refined and defined. And this is what the person you were talking about meant when you said it's like the character's taking over. And they're not really taking over, it's just that you've given them no choice if you're being true to how they would be thinking and feeling. I haven't explained this very well, I'm afraid. No, let's explain it now.
The least attractive character in Indian is an American academic named Eldon Pike, who seeks out for his younger sister, Lenord, to discover the truth about the end of Flora's life. Did you have to make him an American?
Well, I based him on Joe Coelho, so I don't have much choice.
He insisted on being an American?
You know, that is a very good question to ask, and the answer is touché. Because, no, he did not have to be an American. I wish I could say that I wrote this play around about 1970, but I didn't. I wrote it in 1992 or something. And I should have known better than to reach for the available sort of joke, you know.
The ugly American.
No, it's not to do with that at all. It's to do with academia. America, as you know, is always in advance of other civilizations, and sometimes that's a very beneficial thing to be. And sometimes one feels that one is kind of being pulled along by America in ways which are not very welcome. I personally regret the fact that Leicester Square is getting more and more like Times Square, which this is a private conversation, is it? I have yet to meet anybody who lives in New York who likes Times Square. I must tell you, when I moved, the theatre very sweetly got an apartment for us, because we're here for several weeks with a gap, so instead of being in a hotel, we had a little apartment on West 48th. And the day we moved in, there was a lady in the elevator with her suitcase moving out after 20 years. And she said, "You moving in?" And I said, "No, we're just here for a few days." And she said, "Well, that's why I'm getting out. It's turning into a hotel." And when I moved here 20 years ago, the whole area was drugs and prostitution, but it's gone downhill.
it similar in London? Because off of Piccadilly, you have Soho, which used to be the red light district as well. And,
We're not talking
that's
about
completely
that.
done.
We're talking about the marketplace. We're talking about the fact that we now have a situation where there are bleachers to accommodate maybe 150 people who sit there to look at the advertisements. That is what there is to see. Kind of strange. Advertisements aren't supposed to have a captive audience. Advertisements are things which get in your way when you're trying to live. I think this is a private conversation, guys.
Now you're in New York partly because two plays are opening and rehearsals are going on right now for The Real Thing. Is there a reason that a revival of The Real Thing is being paired with this new production of Indian Ink?
Yeah, there is a reason, because Paul Carey, she never succeeded in getting the Roundabout to agree to put on Indian Ink. And a few months ago, I got this call saying, could you let us do The Real Thing? To which I replied, yeah, absolutely, but if you want to do a play of mine, why don't you do Indian Ink? I've been asking you for 10 years. And they hummed and hawed, and then they ended up with this scheme, bless them, where Indian Ink was in the small house, and The Real Thing was in the American Airlines, the big house.
With a huge all-star cast.
Well, not a huge cast,
Well, I mean, an all-star.
but a big name cast. Ewan McGregor, Maggie Gyllenhaal, Cynthia Nixon, absolutely, yeah, that's great. But that's how that happened.
That play also plays with language because Max and Charlotte's narrow spat at the start is, we think we're watching something by Noel Coward or a Noel Coward type playwright, but then we learn it's not the real thing.
Yeah,
It's a play within a play.
And it says, the first scene turns out to have been written by a character in the second scene, which was my starting point, as a matter of fact. I thought it would be nice to write a play where the first scene turns out to have been written by somebody in the second scene. And the first time we did the play, which was 30 years ago or so, of course, we were fixated on how to control that moment, that sort of denouement in the second scene, because you understand that the art of playwriting consists of controlling the flow of information that goes from the stage to the audience. That's what you're doing. You have a tap which you can turn on and off, and you decide which order the information ought to come and how expansive it ought to be, or how succinct, and so on. So with this play, The Real Thing, we were all naturally sort of fixated on how to make the penny drop for everyone at the same time in the second act. Oh, I see. Oh my God, I get it now. That first scene he wrote from love. He's a playwright. He wrote that. Okay. Because of course it was completely impossible and absurd, because people, they weren't, as it were, ratcheted together. Everybody was kind of getting there at a different moment. And that's what you settle for. When the play was revived, some years later, and that was a production which came here actually with Stephen Delane and Jennifer Ely. Anyway,
The daughter of Rosemary Harris, isn't she?
Indeed, the daughter of Rosemary Harris. Yeah. Anyway, so here was the situation again, and I was thinking, but this is ridiculous, because a lot of people who come to see the play will have seen it before 10 years ago, or anyway know pretty much what happens in it. So why are we trying to conceal this thing, and why are we trying to control the information in this obsessive way? So we stopped doing that, and it led me to question the whole notion and principle of the denouement, you know. So much of theatre is concerned with concealing things from the audience in order to surprise the audience. And I began to get much more interested in the idea of not surprising them, but actually letting them see how the characters got there. And I think this may be something to do with the question we started off with plays in 2 time frames, because when you have a play in 2 time frames, you can very easily manipulate a situation where the audience knows things that the characters don't. And that's always a quite interesting situation, especially if you're watching somebody who's trying to figure out something and you've already been shown the answer. And then the practice, the sight and sound of somebody trying to figure something out turns out to be, in a different way, just as interesting as it were, being with that person when the character arrives at the solution and you're simultaneously enlightened, which is the way that Agatha Christie works, for example. Difficult to do well, but that's the difference.
You said that the real thing was, that in the real thing, one of the stimuli was repeating a situation 3 times.
Not a situation, well, yes. You know, these plays, they're far from naturalistic. They might have the, as it were, the get-up and the set-up of a kind of realism.
Well, you're dealing with politics in that play. Politics, real politics, aren't you?
The whole thing about the storytelling is that, irrespective of what the subject matter is, the structure is the nature of the play. And just as our structure is somehow our nature. So what happens in a play like The Real Thing, as it turns out, is that you have a situation where a character who's unhappy at that moment takes something out of a bag, a gift, and this moment is repeated with a different character later, and then a third time. Yeah, these are conscious compositions.
You want the audience to notice, or should they slip by?
No, I think that I want the audience to just be aware of a pattern and a rhythm, and I don't mind if some of them don't quite articulate it or bring it to a conscious level. I don't even mind if, in a funny kind of way, if it's just in there deep. You know the story of somebody telling Billy Wilder that there was some grievous flaw in some plot of some movie he made. And he said, yeah, I know. But what happens is that, you know, people, you watch this film, you have no problem, it's really good, and you wake up at 3 in the morning because you feel like a glass of milk, and you go downstairs to the kitchen, and as you open the refrigerator door, you go, wait a minute! And it's just too late. Too late. So, I guess I don't mind when this wait a minute moment occurs.
At one point in The Real Thing, Henry the playwright is criticized for wasting his talent on a science fiction script. You helped write the screenplay of Brazil, which is kind of science fiction. It's also rumored that you assisted George Lucas in polishing up some of the dialogue for Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade and Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. Also, Tim Burton on Sleepy Hollow. So were you kind of making a joke about yourself there?
It's not really to do with science fiction as such. It was more to do with, it's more to do with, well, Henry's in the play, he's being rather snobby about it, because I'm a bit snobby about it. But you know, one lives and works among friends, and quite often one is sort of doing stuff with friends, anonymously, hopefully one hopes. And I've usually had a sort of, it's usually fun.
Well, Henry's wife Annie wants him to help sharpen the play by an anti-nuclear protester. And Annie tells Henry doesn't want to do it. She says, to you he can't write, to him writing is all you can do. And Henry defends words as innocent, neutral, precise, only altered when they're used in polemics. Was Henry talking to you in that case?
There's a whole big riff he goes into about the use of language and how it's important that certain words, you know, stay with meanings which represent certain things.
He says the writer's role is to write well.
Who says that? No, that's J.G. Ballard.
Back to J.G.
You know, he does say it in other words, in different ways he's saying that. Yeah, that is, it's not autobiography because it's not about my life, but it's auto-intellect. It is about what I think. Yeah, that absolutely is. Yeah.
Looking at your career as a whole, it's often said that there are two clear phases with the demarcation line at either 1977 or 1982. Do you recognize that as a way of looking at your work?
No, I don't.
Well, because the plays shift from the earlier, wittier ones into things that are a bit deeper and a bit more philosophical. And then you didn't go to college, and I suspect that you might have, if you had, majored in philosophy, philology, or metaphysics, because those later plays are all just filled with knowledgeable references to those in other specialized fields.
Yes, well, you're right, I didn't go to college, but you're also right, I read a lot of stuff when I was writing. I mean, back in 1970, I was working on a play about a moral philosopher. It was, in fact, a comedy stroke farce, but nevertheless, I read for enjoyment a lot of the kind of stuff you needed to know. I've always done that, right up to the present moment. Sorry,
I was just thinking, is there a difference between being an autodidact, as you are, as opposed to having studied those things in school? Do you regret not having taken a course on Nietzsche when you could have when you were a kid?
Later on, I began to regret not having been to university. Not so much of what I was going to be taught, but I ended up in a place where it was assumed that I'd read a lot of stuff which I hadn't read. That was one thing. The other thing is that people who were at university, they form a kind of network which is a very interesting and sometimes useful thing to be part of, whereas I came out of journalism, so it's a completely different set of people, which became more or less irrelevant once I started writing plays. So on that kind of level, I often thought, I wish I'd gone to university. But I became a junior journalist. I was a cover reporter on a regional paper before I was 18. And for the next 6 years, I had a lot of experience which you don't get at college. And
You became a drama critic.
That was possibly one of the less important experiences. You leave school and you find yourself covering police courts and coroner's courts and local government stuff, and indeed theatre stories, that's true. So that educates you in certain ways, doesn't it? So I shouldn't really regret anything. I think I've really been very lucky.
You did the writing about it, reviewing plays, get you thinking about how to write a play. Were you a good theatre critic?
No.
Because you also worked in London as a drama critic. You were having a lot of fun. You used the pseudonym William Booth.
I think I used it for the other pieces I was writing in the same magazine.
Wikipedia.
No, you're right, I did use that.
Got that from even more.
Yeah, and that is quite true. I was not a good drama critic because I completely misunderstood the job. I went into it, I didn't do it at an elevated level, by the way, but I did a certain amount of theatre reviewing for about a year in the early 60s. And I thought that every work of art which I encountered in a theatre had a kind of God-given mark out of 10, you know. So you go to the, I don't know, Doll's House, and that had to be 8+, surely. And similar with performances, I had a feeling that my job was to kind of figure out how many marks out of 10 it would deserve. It never occurred to me that the job consisted entirely of reporting what effect the piece had on your own mind. So I was a complete failure as a critic.
But there were a lot of critics who did, for a long time, I think the Times used to give stars to different plays. And we're grateful that they've stopped.
We have that.
5-star play.
Yes. It becomes a kind of shorthand, which is slightly unfortunate.
Why read the review if it only got 2 stars?
Well, presumably the stars came in because people weren't reading the reviews.
It's both ways. You were talking about some of the reasons some of these, you got thinking about some of these plays. I was thinking about travesties. Did that come to you just simply because you noticed that James Joyce, Vladimir Lenin, and Tristan Tzara were all living in Zurich at the same time?
Yes, actually, that's pretty much it. I was reading a book, and in this book it appeared that James Joyce and Lenin and one of the founding Dadaists, Tristan Tzara, were all in this place, not only at the same time, but during a world war. They were in this enclave of non-war.
And Lenin would go to the Cafe Voltaire, which was the home of Dadaism, and say, what the hell are these people doing?
I don't know that Lenin ever went to the Cafe. I would like to think he did. But 1917 was an interesting period for the Bolsheviks, obviously. It ended up with them on a train to Moscow, Leningrad. But anyway, I think, I said earlier that I felt what I was doing nowadays was really finding a story to tell. Earlier on, that probably wasn't the case. I think with my first, there were certainly some plays early on, and probably travesties as well, where I didn't really have a story. And travesties turned out to be quite fun because it was quite funny, apart from anything else. But actually, it's not really heading anywhere. I don't know how strong a play it is. I think it's a play which I'm slightly astonished by it because there
How many
are
stars would you have given it?
Well, more interestingly, for what? I think there are speeches Well, as a play, it appeals, actually all theatre appeals, I think, properly to people who come to halfway to meet it. It's a bit like being in church, you know. There's no point in going inside unless you're prepared to go some way to meet what's there. You know, but I know from my experience with, travesties as against, let's say, Arcadia, that actually a story with a sort of beginning, middle, and end is a lot to do with which plays get done most. And actually, the real thing will be an example. This is the third real thing in New York, which works out at one a decade. And I think if you can get a play revived once every decade, you can chalk that up as a success. Mostly, I would think that plays end up being done very occasionally by people who have one reason or another to be, as it were, aficionados of a particular writer and so on. Sorry, I'm just rambling on a bit here.
Well, I'm going to throw this on to the audience, but I'm thinking about just how funny some of the things in these plays are, even in the more serious ones. Does it just come out as you're writing the dialogue that somebody says something witty and then do you make yourself laugh when you're writing it down?
Pretty much it just falls off the end of the nib. Which sounds semi-facetious, but actually, in one sense, writing is about the next line. What is the next line?
It's also about setting up situations that lend themselves to funny, which is like the sitcoms in recent sitcoms here are really all about one-liners, but the better sitcoms, classic American sitcoms and British sitcoms are all about setting up a situation which then leads to something that is really funny.
Well, it's different sorts of funny. I'm quite good at the verbal ones, but the ones which I really kind of value, God knows there are not many in my work, but there are people who are different, they're different kind of writer. I mean, Alan Ayckbourn is somebody who's written about 70 plays. His plays are profoundly funny, very often, just on the level of human behavior, human psychology. And they are situational comedies. The situations, I don't know, maybe you saw, there was the Norman Conquest, wasn't there, a trilogy. I mean, they're just so brilliantly managed, and they make you laugh a great deal, but it's Chekhovian laughter, and I absolutely take my hat off to it. Mostly with me, it's the smart remark, the smart comeback, which gives a play, certainly a play like The Real Thing.
Well, but I was thinking that those comebacks are all true to the character, which is
one hopes
rather than just simply somebody making the next.
I don't think I'm above changing a character's character for the sake of a little line. Unscrupulous. I don't know. I get uncomfortable if people say nice things about my place, so I start knocking them.
Okay, what play do you want to say terrible things about now, or should we go to the audience?
Well, yes, we should probably. Are you? I don't know what time we started. I'm very happy to take questions if anybody has questions.
I see a hand over there.
Hi.
Just stand up.
Sure. I wanted to thank you first of all for coming, and it's a pleasure hearing you. I read a review, I think you posted in The Guardian, I think a year ago, about Honesty and Pinter. and storytelling, and you say that Pinter's sort of a playwright who arrives at the same time as the audience. Because in Pinter's plays, you never know what's going to happen next, and Pinter doesn't know what's going to happen next. Would you say that you're the same way, or you've sort of come a step ahead of the audience, or how do you sort of think about that?
I'm going to ask Lenord to repeat the question for the sake of...
I was hoping you would repeat it.
Well,
That's about something that you said Pinter said about keeping ahead of the audience, and he was wondering whether you see yourself in the same way.
I don't know if this is doing justice to your question. I feel we're very different writers, much as I admire Pinter plays. And do you know a play called Old Times? It's a wonderful play. Old Times is a play in which there are two women and one man. And when the play starts, the man is standing in the room, maybe looking out the window, and the two women are talking. Sorry, the woman is... Start again. The man and woman are talking, and there's a second woman who is standing in the room. In whenever it was, 80 something, the idea of having an actual person, an actor being a character in a room, he wasn't really there yet. He was going to enter later, but he was there. It was actually quite strange. And I think I'm right in saying that, because I remember my own response, I think I'm right in saying that it was a very puzzling thing to come across in a theatre. And the play progresses, and then the second woman becomes part of the conversation. And the fact that she's been in the room all that time, quite a long time, 15, 20 minutes, as I remember, I can't remember. It was kind of really, it felt like some ground had been broken. So I just come from a technical rehearsal of the real thing, where this very brilliant young director is doing stuff to the real thing, and the Samuel, and the scenes are starting to overlap a bit. People who shouldn't be there are there. And in other words, although I'm not entirely sure what the thrust of your question was, it's worth using the occasion to point out that Harold Pinter did something which I certainly haven't done. He changed the language of theatre. He actually changed, and so as did Samuel Beckett.
Was that character present in another way? Was the point that character was present in the relationship, even though she wasn't actually...
He was in their background, he was in their history, of that man and woman. When I saw Waiting for God...
That was before cell phones.
That's all right, I don't mind cell phones. I think you should all keep your phones on in case something important happens. When I saw... Waiting for Godot, which was really like a year after, sort of, like, it's pretty early, it was probably 1955. It hadn't been around a lot. I was just completely astounded by it, because it seemed to completely redefine the minima of theatrical validation. In other words, one had always thought to have a play, you had to have X, and then you suddenly had this thing where it was X minus 3, but it was still a play. And that was something to think about. With Pinter, there were other things to think about. And the main one was, and this is what was so much to do with the life which never managed to creep onto the stage nearly all the time. It just didn't get there. And it was that up till then, the deal was, the contract was, that you could believe that the characters were telling the truth. Unless it was Murder at the Vicarage, where somebody was lying, etc. So I don't mean that. But just in their transactions with each other, the idea before 1950 was that you could trust what the person was purporting to believe, because that's how the thing worked. And the idea that people didn't actually feel impelled to tell the truth about themselves, and actually that sometimes their silence was more eloquent than their speech, that was, again, a new way of dealing with something which had been around in one form or another for 2,500 years that we know about.
Another question? How can you feel personally less than?
How do you feel?
Still not.
It's got to be done like a relay. You just tell the person in front of you.
Play a game with telephone.
How you deal with less than generous review?
Oh, how do you deal with a bad review? He said, with a less than generous review, how do you deal with it?
Kingsley Avis, who was the father of one of your speakers this season to come, said that a bad review spoils your breakfast, but not your lunch. Which I thought was a good way of dealing with it.
Well, a lot of actors say they don't read their reviews because if it's too good, then it messes up their minds, and if it's too bad, it messes up their minds.
Well, I called up one of my actors on the morning after an opening, and her husband said, no, she can't come to the phone. She's in the toilet not reading the reviews. I read them. I want to know what, I just have the curiosity about it.
Well, can a review that really understands what you're going to do, but isn't always 100% complimentary, can that be appreciated?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I rarely, just very now and again, I read a review which I consider to be so obtuse that I just think, well, this man's an idiot. On most occasions, I find reservations embedded in a review. I find the reservations extremely plausible, quite suggestive. Yeah. I get good reviews and I get bad reviews, and I end up feeling overpraised or underappreciated, essentially.
Well, the bad reviews are the ones that always resonate a bit more, aren't they? People can tell you 100 times you're fabulous, and then one person says, boy, are you...
The reviews, I don't think so.
I guess that only happens to radio hosts.
I have, 2 or 3 times I've written about science stuff, the reviews, there are very few of them, but the ones I really care about are the reviews which are written for Scientific American or something, because it's very important to me to be accurate. But generally, the world of reviewing is just not quite how it's perceived. I'm extremely anxious that a play of mine gets good reviews because the actors have to show up every night. I don't. And there's a kind of collegiate thing about putting a play on. So you've all been in the same rubber boat for weeks, rehearsing and so forth. So you're a little group of people, and naturally we all want the others to feel good about what they're doing and so on. So, that's an important aspect. Anyway, thank you for the question.
I know you have to run, so we have time for perhaps one more.
Stoppard. My name is Sean, and I have one question.
Only one? Okay.
Nice to see you, Mr. Banner.
Nobody can hear you. Say it loudly.
How do you like to raise objections to audiences?
How do you like to raise objections to audiences?
What does that mean?
Do you understand what that question means?
No. What is meant by raising objections to audiences? Not clear. That could mean more than one thing. Well, we'll move on.
Okay. Yes. You talked about the psychology of the play developing, but what happens when you're dealing with characters who already have been established, like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, or a real-life character like James Joyce? And all of the characters in Utopia.
Yeah, it's a perfectly legitimate question from where you're sitting, but I didn't have a policy about it. I tend to answer as though I had a policy, but it's all retrospective. These are the sorts of questions which for some reason don't arise when you're doing the work. It's very difficult to explain. You go somewhere. In my play, Coast of Utopia, there's a critic called Belinsky, who was a young, rather sick, ill person who was a revered critic of literature in the 1830s to 40s in Russia. And I wish I could quote him properly, but I'll more or less quote him. He says, I'm not a poet or a playwright. I can't write a poem. There was this guy whose articles about literature would be passed around his young readers by candlelight because they were semi-banned in Tsarist Russia. And this man who was so revered by that generation, he was saying, look, I can't actually do the stuff I'm writing. I can't write a poem. You can watch a poet writing a poem. I'll make him male for the sake of recounting this. I understand that the poet might as well be equally my female, but he says, you're right, you watch this poet trying to write a poem, and he sits at the table, the pen in his hand, not moving. And then he moves, and you've missed it. Where did he go in that moment? And that's how I feel about it. You know, where do you go? Lenord was asking me, you know, we're having this fairly light-hearted, but we mean it kind of conversation. He's asking where the line, how do you get to the good line? And I appeared to reply semi-facetiously, falls off the end of the pen. But it was only half facetious, you understand me. Where do we go?
Right annoyed by those kinds of questions. Edward Albee, when he was asked, where do your ideas come from? He said on the stage, Schenectady.
My reply is usually Harrods.
One more. Okay. Okay, back there. Wait, you. You've had enough, man. Let's go. So we'll try to repeat it, but you have to say it loud enough. Her question is,
Yeah. But in fact, I did Latin and Greek when I was in the 6th form, which is the last year of school. But what happened with that was this is a play about Alfred Hausmann, who was the author of A Shropshire Lad, a book of poems, which has never been out of print, you know, for more than a century, and who was also the most distinguished Latin scholar of his day. And this is sort of answer to your question, I think. Well, I didn't know those two facts until quite late in life. I just knew he was a poet, and I sort of vaguely knew the poems. And I had absolutely no interest or intention of writing about Alfred Hausmann. But the moment I read, or maybe just recollected, that he was also a classicist with a reputation for a kind of vituperative conversation with colleagues, other professors. The moment I kind of was told, well, he was that as well, it was an instant desire to write a play about him, because you can see at a stroke that the entire world of the classical versus the romantic, the divide, or the thing which divides them and the thing which connects them, the classical and the romantic, suddenly seem to be incorporated in this single human being. And that was enough to make me want to get back into Latin and find out why he was distinguished and why he was notorious. And it became such an enjoyable adventure going back into Latin and reading about Hausmann in different ways, that in the end I had to force myself to stop preparing this play and to start to write it. because I was writing it for a particular space and a particular director. And in the end, I had to push it for by 1 year, and then I still kept reading until I had to. So I don't know that that had anything to do with my being at college or not being at college. I feel it didn't. I feel it triggered something else in me. It triggered this strange disjunction between the head and the heart. And that's what certainly semi-consciously and possibly consciously made me want to write about him.
Indian Ink is about Indian art and its relation to Indian culture, and the contrast with European art, because you have artists coming out of two different cultures. This is obviously something that interests you in the same way, because you talked a lot about the rasas, the ancient Indian traditions of art.
The rasa, which Ned is referring to, is really interesting. I knew nothing about it. And actually, I hope this isn't disillusioning, but no, I was not actually interested in writing about Indian art and Western art. I was interested in writing about this young woman, this young poet, who goes to India ill and dies there.
Well, she goes because she has tuberculosis, and she goes to India for her health. She may be the only person who ever went to India for her health with tuberculosis.
No, that's all true too. I was in the middle of this play. She was having her portrait painted by a local artist in the town where she's presently situated. And I was in the Tottenham Court Road going somewhere, and there was this art bookshop at the top of Charing Cross Road. And I saw this book about Indian art, and I went in there and started looking at it, and came across this thing about rasa, which is the, as it were, the juice that every work of art. It's partly to do with what's in the work of art, and partly the word to describe what feelings it should evoke in the observer. I've never heard the word or the conception, but I then read a bit of this, then bought the book, and then carried on with wherever I was going. It was completely accidental. And then I have to also stress that I just got to the point in writing the play where I needed something like this. The play I've most recently been working on, which I probably don't really want to get into too much, but it's about a young woman who is saying her prayers. I don't mean that's the action of the play, but it's about somebody who is a researcher in a science institute who is also saying her prayers. She has a private emotion which leads to her simultaneously being at a kind of cutting edge research institution and on her knees by her bed. These dichotomies are very attractive to me, and when they're embodied in a single person, they're irresistible. There we are.
Indian Ink is at the Laura Pell's Theater on 46th Street and 6th Avenue, and the American Airlines Theater is on 42nd Street, where when is that opening? When is the real thing opening?
Well, actually, I think it's on now. It's actually opening as we sit here. It started an hour and a half ago.
So you have two opportunities.
Opportunities.
Yeah.
Yeah, the new thing opens the end of October.
That's Anything is opening today at the Laura Bells.
Yeah.
And then the real thing is in rehearsal.